Welcome back everyone. In this video, I want to talk about rendering samples using Arnold. Solid Angle has a dedicated page for Maya rendering users. Also, they have a section called Samples and Removing Noise. If you haven't done so, I would encourage you to read through those pages to get a better picture on what samples are. Now let's head over to Maya, where I have a basic scene prepared. These are the default rendering settings. You can load them by load preset default. In this tutorial, I want to talk about each AA sample and what they actually do. Before we start the IPR, I want to set each AA sample to 0, just that you can see what they actually do when they are enabled one by one. Also the ray depth. So now let's start an IPR session. As you might have guessed, the result is noisy. This is mostly due to the AA samples on the lights. So first, let's change them to 2. And you already get a way cleaner result. And be aware, all the other samples are on 0 and you still get a result. What is important to know is that diffuse and glossy samples are only for the indirect sample noise. SSS is dedicated to subsurface scattering shaders, and refraction is only for glossy refractions. So when the refraction glossiness is on 0, you can leave this also on 0 just to save some rendering time. The AA samples is a global multiplier for all the other samples inside of Arnold. Each sample is squared and then multiplied with the camera AA samples. So as a test, let's set this to 3, which is squared, resulting in 9. So this value is multiplied with the diffuse samples currently on 0. So let's put them also to 3, which are essentially 9 samples. And then the final rays per pixel would be 9 times 9 for diffuse rays. And you can already see that the render is getting cleaner. The camera AA samples are responsible for light samples, for motion blur, and for depth of field. They are only responsible for those values. So if you want to have a clean depth of field, you would have to increase those samples very high until you get something clean. The same as for motion blur. Because the AA samples is multiplied by the light samples, you already get some very clean result just by a value of 3. Let's increase the value to see a clean result. Now let's have a look at the AOVs. The direct diffuse is controlled only by the camera AA samples combined with the light samples. All the direct AOVs are controlled by the camera AA samples. So they are all clean. We don't have Specular 2 for now, but it would appear in here as well. The indirect passes are only controlled by the diffuse and the glossy AA samples. I have prepared a Cornell box, which is a cube with one face open and some colored sides of the cube. So let's unhide them. In the viewport you can see what it looks like. I've got red on the left, green on the right, and just a gray laminate shader at the bottom and top. Currently, we still don't have any indirect bounces. And also in the reflection chrome ball, you can see that there is nothing happening. So we don't actually get a reflection back of the chrome ball. So now let's introduce indirect diffuse. One sample for this. And the result is not changed because we don't have any ray depth. So let's put this to 1 as well. And immediately you can see that we get the red bounce on the object. And now let's head over to the indirect diffuse AOV. And you can see how noisy this is. So let's increase the diffuse to 4. And immediately you can see that it's getting way cleaner now, just by changing the diffuse samples. Changing this back to 1 will give you a noisy result. Let's introduce some glossy rays by increasing the ray depth to 1 and the glossy samples to 1 as well. Immediately you can see that we get some indirect reflections in the chrome ball. Essentially what the ray depth is, it defines how many bounces the diffuse ray has. Currently it is set to 1, so the ray which hits the surface will bounce off to hit one other surface and then shade the pixel on that position. If you put this to 2, the bounce will have an additional bounce to catch another color, which gives you a more realistic result, but it is more expensive because the samples are multiplied by this value as well. So changing the diffuse samples to 2 will give you a brighter result and a stronger color bleeding effect. The same happens for glossy samples. If you put this to 2, the glossy indirect bounces will bounce off one additional step. You possibly wonder why the result is still noisy. It is because of the diffuse and glossy samples are so low. Let's confirm this in the AOVs. The indirect specular pass is okay, but you still get some noise on these edges and in the front here. So let's put this value to 2 and see what we get here. It may not be that visible on the video, but we got rid of lots of the noise. Let's head over to the indirect diffuse and increase the diffuse samples to 2 as well, and increase the AA samples to 4. You can already see a cleaner result in the indirect pass. And let's check the beauty. And you can see that it is getting very clean now. We still get some noise in the occluded area, and the only way to get rid of this is either by adding an additional direct light or by increasing the diffuse samples. The glossy samples also controls the smoothness of the surface. So if I would have a really rough surface, to get that clean as well, you need to increase the glossy samples. So the rougher the surface, the more samples you need to get it smooth and clean. If you have no rough surface, like a clean mirrored surface, you can also leave the glossy samples to 0, which will deliver a super clean indirect spec pass, as well as a direct spec pass. But this is very look dependent, and you won't always have super clean surfaces, so keep that in mind. If you have got a production scene, in most cases you would render the motion blur, which is expensive, so to get a clean motion blur, you would increase the AA samples quite high. On the current show I am working, we have really fast moving objects and flying objects, and for them to render clean, we have AA samples of 12 and all the other samples on 1. This would be our final render settings, because they are quite expensive, but they deliver clean motion blur. Let me just add a sphere to show you the effect of the motion blur. I have animated the sphere vertically, so let's enable motion blur, but first let's change AA samples to 3. Let me just hide the Cornell box for now, just that you visually can see what the AA samples do. The higher the AA samples, the cleaner the motion blur. On 6 it's already quite clean. Let's go back to 8, and now you have a super clean motion blur, which means that this value is now 64, and this will multiply all the other samples with that value. Keep in mind that you don't have diffuse or glossy or any other samples higher than 3. Mostly a value of 1 is totally fine because it's 64 times 1, which gives you 64 rays in the indirect diffuse and 64 rays per pixel on the indirect glossy rays. So let's unhide geometry. And you can see that now the noise, the indirect noise, is also clean. We get a clean motion blur and we get a clean render. If you still have noise on the occluded areas, you would increase the diffuse samples. So let's change them to 2 and render the foot area which is occluded by the object. Now let's talk about SSS samples. But first lower the AA samples, so we get a faster feedback. And change the shader to be a subsurface shader. I don't want any specular on this. So this is now a flat shader. Now let's add some SSS. As you might expect it renders black because it's fully SSS and we don't have any samples for this. So let's give them one sample. And you can immediately see that we get a nice translucent Buddha, which is noisy as hell. But the only way to get a smooth SSS pass is by changing the SSS samples. Let's try something like 4. Keep in mind it's multiplied by the square of this value. So after a minute we got a result. It is still noisy, but we're getting there and it looks quite nice actually. Whatever it is, it looks okay. So heading back over to the 8 samples to get the final motion blur render, we possibly need to reduce the SS samples, because otherwise the render won't finish in a long time. Let's change them back to 1 and see what the SSS pass looks like. Okay, it's definitely too noisy, so let's change it to 2 and see. Keep in mind we also have a diffuse depth of 2, which also increases render times. I think now the result is okay. You can still see some noise, but overall it's looking quite good. And keep in mind, we're actually rendering motion blur. Now let's introduce the specular lobes again. So after a good while, the render finally finished. And unfortunately, you can still see some noise. So all you have to do is increase SS samples and render again. Luckily, in productions, you have big render farms to take care of that. But with Arnold, you get the full physically accuracy. I hope I could give you a brief introduction on how to set up your rendering samples to give you the best possible output. Keep in mind, camera A samples squared are multiplied with all the other samples squared as well. The refraction ray depth controls how deep a refraction ray penetrates an object. If you got lots of glass panes behind each other, or an object like this which has folds of geometry on top of each other, the refraction depth needs to be increased. I hope I could give you a brief introduction on the AA samples inside of Arnold. If you have any more questions, feel free to ask me. I would gladly help you guys out in setting up your render settings.